So we're looking at incest in American history before 1970, and this is just a brief overview of some of the major themes. Colonial America, we know that there were laws against incest, that those laws were based on the Bible, but the historians have looked for information, have found a lack of court cases. It seems unlikely that that actually reflects a lack of incest occurring, but it doesn't seem to be dealt with in the court system in that era. 19th century is very different. Starting around 1800, we get a whole wave of court cases, and those court cases are dealt with in the newspapers of all types. Everybody from the sort of respectable newspapers to the Police News Gazette, which was a working class paper that sort of specialized in scandal and crime, would cover these. There was an element of pornographic fascination, the historian I'm drawing on felt, because men were fascinated with these cases, and they would come and pack the courtrooms to see what happens in the trial and to hear the testimony. Generally, it was not charged as incest, it was charged as rape or assault. Incest was not very chargeable. So what they would go after would be rape, and so they'd be using the standards of rape. What was going on in terms of reporting was across the social classes. So you would have cases among working class and poor people, and that was sort of expected, those kinds of people to do those kinds of things. And so there would be publications about that. But there also would be cases of middle class, elite, respectable households where incest had occurred. And in fact, the Police News Gazette took a special delight in those cases, because they wanted to expose the so-called respectable and show them that they aren't, under the skin. They're the same as everyone else. The problem, of course, is always proving it. And maternal support was really important. Probably if you didn't have support from your mother or someone like that, you would not be able to do all the things that were necessary to get your trial to go to court. Unfortunately, though, if this is a case of father-daughter incest, which is what we're talking about in this lecture, wives for a long time were not allowed to testify against their husbands in court. So your mother can be there for you. She can support you in the process, but she cannot actually offer testimony to support you. A lot depended on the victim's testimony. And this is a time period where for a rape conviction, you're really expected to prove that you fought back, that you did not accede to what was happening to you. And so a lot of emphasis was placed on the victim's testimony. And of course, if she was a woman who was seen as being, or a girl who was seen as being non-chaste, as someone who had male friends, who was up to things, then it didn't matter how much she had been hurt. She's not going to be seen as being eligible because her reputation has been damaged. Physical damage they will look for, but a lot of times that kind of physical damage in children will go away within about 48 hours, according to some studies. The other thing was infection, gonorrhea in particular. And that was often a sign that mothers would draw on to sort of say, something very wrong has happened. My daughter has this pus, or she is infected. Something must have happened to her to cause this. It's a little difficult because two things. First of all, they weren't really clear about the distinction between gonorrhea and other kinds of infections that might cause pus. So it was sort of difficult to prove that it was gonorrhea. Second reason is that doctors believed that if they gave the wrong information, they could condemn an innocent man, right? And so they were very concerned about that. And so they were often reluctant to testify to that in court. So it was difficult, but despite that, a number of girls were able to prove their cases. In the early 20th century, things shift again. And the critical shift is it's a time period around 1900, give or add a decade. It's a time period in which a racial hierarchy is developing, which places white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top, Catholics further down, immigrants from Eastern Europe further down, and so forth, Jewish people, and eventually down to African Americans. And the idea is that those whites at the top had achieved a level of civilization that made it very difficult for people to think of them as committing something as horrible as incest. It's something that poor people would do, poor fathers would do, immigrant fathers would do, people of color would do, but it was not something that modern white Americans would do. They're too civilized for it. Increasingly, they don't see those cases. Now, this doesn't happen all the time, but there's an increasing amount of cases which are not investigated because the father is seen as too civilized, too white, too trustworthy. The child welfare system, which is developing at this point in time, and mostly it's charity organizations, they often did not pursue and follow up on incest possibilities. So I was reading, and one example was given of a girl who had a gonorrhea infection, who was sleeping in the bed with her father who had a gonorrhea infection. And they basically decided it must have been the blanket's fault. So sometimes they will follow up, particularly if the girl demands it. But a lot of times they're not going out and pursuing incest, particularly in white families of a certain status. And middle-class families basically don't show up in the child welfare system. There are cases where they go to court, and sometimes fathers are convicted for this. But the thing is, he may go to prison, but the victim is seen as having lost her sexual innocence. And by losing her sexual innocence, she is no longer a good girl. And so it's not suitable for her to stay at home with other innocent children. And so frequently, victims of incest will end up institutionalized in reform schools, juvenile facilities, because they're seen as tainted by what happened to them. Gonorrhea is a problem in that at the turn of the century, they identified gonorrhea, so you could go under a microscope and see it. And they came up with a test that would test it and say, this is gonorrhea. So you no longer have the problem of some other kind of secretion that you think is going on and that you don't know if it's gonorrhea or not. Well, now you know if it's gonorrhea or not because you can test it. The big revelation, though, is they find out that girls are infected across all social classes at pretty much the same rate. And so it's not just the girls who are supposed to be infected, the poor girls, the immigrant girls, the girls of color who are living with people who are seen as likely to have abused them and infected them. It's good middle-class girls and upper-class girls from nice white households. They have also shown that gonorrhea can only be transmitted through sexual contact. And they hold that to be true for men, for women, and for boys. However, they decide that because clearly those nice white middle-class girls are not getting infected by, for example, their father committing incest, something else must be happening. And so they begin speculating. There's a whole panic about toilet seats. That's why you have those paper things sometimes that you can put down on the toilet seat. Well, that was supposed to protect against gonorrhea. Blankets, like I said before, towels, sponges, all of these things are seen as being possible culprits for passing on gonorrhea because they are just not willing to admit that the obvious could be happening. So what do you do if you've got a girl who's got gonorrhea? Well, first of all, you direct the mother to sanitize the home and the child, and it's very lengthy protocols that they ask for, both in terms of the medical treatments for the child and for sanitizing the home. And there's sort of an implication that the mother is really the problem in the first place, because if she was keeping the home properly sanitary, this wouldn't have happened. Increasingly, there's a push to try to exclude these girls from school. And the thing that saves them, a lot of them, from being excluded from school is the fact that they don't get reported to the school authorities. But there are a number of girls who are excluded from school and not allowed to attend because they've been infected with gonorrhea. And the idea is that they'll transmit it through the school bathrooms or something. And then a lot of the girls end up institutionalized as a solution to the problem. Thing is, between around 1935, 1955, somewhere in the middle of that, there is what one historian has called the moral panic. A great deal of fear that there are sexual psychopaths out there, and they are a threat to children in particular. And these are strange people. They're hobos, they're tramps, they're homosexuals, they're all kinds of bad people. But most importantly, they're strangers to the community, strangers to the children. And that's where the danger is for a child to be sexually abused, is the fear. Just like always, the reality was the real risk was at home and among intimate friends of the family, often. But it was much easier to talk about this as the sexual psychopath who is somewhere else. After World War II, gonorrhea is curable, and it ceases to be a real level of concern about it. There's an increasing level of a declining interest in venereal disease or sexually transmitted diseases in general because they're curable. So there's no longer a problem with things like gonorrhea and syphilis. And it doesn't seem to be really investigated so much as a sign of incest. Forgetting incest, 1950s, 1960s. Devlin points out there's a contradiction there. Social workers are tending to not talk about it. Psychologists are tending to not talk about it. It's not appearing in popular culture. On the other hand, as Devlin points out, people are getting taken to court for committing incest and are getting charged, and in various cases they're getting convicted. And the judges are very harsh on them. So there is still some awareness, but culturally in general, there seems to be a movement away from thinking of incest as a problem. So, in conclusion, you've got some issues that keep coming up. You've got the problem of proving abuse, and that continues to this day, particularly when you're talking about small children who may have limited abilities to communicate. By the way, disabled children are much more likely, like 3 times more likely, to be sexually abused than non-disabled children. So just sort of add that into the complexities of it. In the 19th century, there was a great deal of open awareness of incest as a problem. But by the 20th century, it's increasingly identified with class and race. The white middle class sort of disappears as a possible threat. Though, as Devlin would point out, it's not entirely forgotten. It still remains as a criminal issue. Of course, everything is going to change when we hit the 1970s, and we'll talk about that later.